Our next panel is going to look at some of the solutions for patients and what is still needed on the advocacy and equity front for rare disease. Molly Murray is the president and CEO of the Autoimmune Association. It's a nonprofit working to improve the lives of millions of people affected by autoimmune diseases. We also want to welcome Dr. Marshall Summar, the director of the Rare Disease Institute at the Children's National Hospital. And Juliet Choi is the president and CEO of the Health Justice Organization, the Asian American Pacific Islander American Health Forum. She's also a steering member of the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition. Welcome to all of you. And I want to begin with Juliet Choi. We've been asking for questions from our audience, and this is one from Michael Causey, a tweet with this question for you, Ms. Choi. How important is it to improve clinical trial diversity to address rare diseases and other treatment areas?
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here. And thanks, Steve. What a terrific question. The short answer is yes. Investments in clinical trials is absolutely critical, especially in the context of rare diseases. And I want to underscore and state that we absolutely need to double down, triple down in our investments when we think about clinical trials, but also from a lens of inclusion and communities of color. Just briefly, I would highlight, for example, the National Institutes of Health. Since 1992, out of its incredible budget and priorities for investments in clinical trials, has invested less than 0.2% in clinical trials for the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities. Not 2%, but less than 0.2%. So when it comes to investments, I think this is something we need to look at collectively, advocate for together for rare diseases and also for communities of color.
And Molly Murray, we've been hearing from patients who have been dealing with this. They really do need to navigate through this treatment process, but they first need to figure out what the problem is, what the diagnosis is. Can you address that issue as the CEO of the Autoimmune Association?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, again, thank you for having me be here today as well. But I think you hit on a really important, question, how to navigate the system and get a diagnosis. And I think a major part of that is just awareness about autoimmune disease. We know that less than 6% of Americans can name an autoimmune disease. And so, our job as a patient advocacy organization is to help the community understand, the general public understand what autoimmune diseases is, to ask the right questions and empower themselves to seek a diagnosis and to stay strong and continue to get the answers that they need. And I think that, Representative Davis talked pretty eloquently about that in terms of life and sort of being, an advocate for herself in the system. But it certainly is, part of this is awareness and educating the public that these diseases exist and to keep pushing for answers.
Dr. Summar, from your perspective at Children's National Hospital, you're on the front lines in terms of the research. Can you walk us through the numbers of what we're seeing among children and rare diseases?
Sure. First off, great to be here today. Thank you so much, and to my other panelists here. The numbers are getting interesting. So first thing, since we finished up the Human Genome Project, we are averaging somewhere between 10 to 12 new disease descriptions per week in the rare disease field. So it's an absolutely unprecedented growth compared to any other field of medicine. When we look at the numbers we'll just take a children's hospital as an example. If you get admitted to a children's hospital, there's about a 20% chance that you already have or will shortly have a diagnosis of a rare disease. The numbers for the national population are probably somewhere between 6 and 9%. But in the pediatric population, kids are basically healthy. So if you're coming into a children's hospital, rare disease is a big issue there. Interestingly, we looked at patients who'd come more than once to a children's hospital. 30% of those patients already or had soon carried a diagnosis of a rare disease. So it's a huge impact. The other thing we've looked at is how much what are the resources for these patients? They actually see more specialists than any of our other patient populations. If we look just at referral patterns and everything else, these patients end up, oh goodness gracious, they end up seeing so many people. The organization, the navigation for these families is often quite difficult. And about 30% of the patients we see in our clinic here at Children's National are actually adults. And adults have the same issue. In fact, in many ways, adults have even fewer resources for rare disease than children do, because it's just not something we're used to.
Dr. Summar, you wrote a piece for thehill.com, and I love the analogy, so I want to get your reaction. And
All right.
Molly Murray, I want to get your thoughts as well. But you said, quote, genetics is often cited as the future of medicine. We just need to fix the potholes in the road to get there. So where are the potholes?
Yeah. The potholes there's a couple. One is awareness. So there's a classic model where a physician in a field is expected to know everything about every condition in his field. And while that's true for some specialties to this day, in the field of rare disease, it's just no longer possible. We are dependent and have to work with our patients and families. We have to work with high-end informatics tools and bringing those along. The medical system's not really designed. We work in a medical system that's designed around procedures. It's designed around testing, things like that. But the idea of having it designed around the needs of over, I think currently about 8,000 different conditions, it's not that great. And our payment systems really have got a lot of catching up. I know a lot of our families get very frustrated because they'll work with their payer and the payer will never heard of the condition they have. It may not have even existed a year ago. So lots of potholes, but you know what? There's a lot of folks with shovels and gravel too.
So Molly Murray, I want to get your reaction to that, because in the work that you're doing, different patients have different conditions and it varies. And so this makes it far more complex when it comes to treatment and cures. Molly Murray, did you want to respond to that?
You broke up just a little bit there. Can you repeat your last remarks?
I want to follow up on what Dr. Summar was saying, is that there are potholes in terms of the treatment. And from the work that you're doing, there's such a disparity between one patient and another in terms of what condition he or she has and the potential diagnosis and treatment for that individual.
Yes, and I think, from a patient advocacy perspective, certainly, I touched on this, how important awareness is, but I think there certainly are potholes, right? And one of those potholes, I think, is just patient engagement in patient registries and the clinical trials that Juliet touched upon, right? And so I think unless we can get patients into these settings to collect the data, to be able to have better diagnostic tools and ways to address these sorts of issues, it's going to continue to be a challenge, right? To have this understanding around these diseases, and certainly, the potholes that exist in terms of access to care, like we know, outpatient costs are rising, right? And it's incredibly difficult, for a lot of patients to afford the treatments that they need. And so, again, from a patient advocacy perspective, what can we do to bring awareness around some of these challenges, to make sure that patients are getting the care that they need, that legislators understand the challenges that patients are facing, to be able to navigate and get the care that they need. And certainly, Dr. Summar, touched on this, right, just sort of understanding in the physician community. When I talk about bringing awareness not only to patients, but also to physician communities as well, and provider communities to understand kind of what to look for that rare disease diagnosis and not overlook it is really important. And so I think, again, as a nonprofit organization trying to bring awareness and education around these issues, I think bringing all those stakeholders to the table, can only help patients get the care that they need.
Juliet, Choi, we talked earlier with Dr. Wilson about the disparities among the African American population. From your perspective, with Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, why is there such a disparity? Why not equality when it comes to the type of diagnosis and treatment that should be available to all individuals?
Sure. And I think you may hear some background noise. I've got some engines, fire trucks in the background here. I want to ask us to take a step back here. providing some context from the rare disease perspective, one set of numbers that are floating around include it takes an average of about 5 years of consultations and perhaps a set of 7 clinicians to receive a proper diagnosis when it comes to rare disease. And then where I ask us to take a step back in terms of disparities, whether it's the Black community, Latino, or the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities, it really comes down to, are we making progress in addressing the institutionalized barriers to care? And also, are we empowering and prioritizing community inclusion? For the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities, I think some of the top challenges in terms of access, and I don't think it's unique to our set of communities, but it really comes down to trust and your access to your set of doctors who can walk with you through your journey, especially as you've received a diagnosis with regard to a rare disease. And then even more fundamentally, on the trust factor, is the information that you need, is the discussion that you need to have, can it be conducted in a way that's linguistically accessible? English happens to be my first language, but if English is not your first language, does that mean somehow you're less deserving of being able to have that really informed dialogue with your treatment team? And then when it comes to culturally competent care, I always want to advocate, we need to grow the pipeline. We need to advocate for a diverse pipeline leadership effort so that we see more doctors, more healthcare providers that look like us, that can bring those community inclusive ideas to the table.
And doctor, with regard to the work that you're doing at Children's National Hospital, getting the diagnosis is the first challenge. Right. Dealing with the treatment, which is often another odyssey, is yet another one. Why?
Well, it's you pointed it out just beautifully here. So first, we do have to get a diagnosis. That has its own challenges. Currently, for approved therapies for the 7,000 to 8,000 different conditions, we have about 600 FDA-approved therapies. So one thing we found is often we don't have a ready or at-hand therapy for some of the disorders we do diagnose. For some, we're desperately needing them. Some of them, we've got to develop some new technology, things like that. But also just the day-to-day care, whether it's a therapy that is needed, speech language therapy, physical therapy, school special classes, or special help in school, depending. We've got so many. It's such a wide spectrum of these things that we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how we're going to get that patient the absolute best care we can, given what we have right now. And with so many different scenarios, it gets to be a complex task. But you know what? That's where the partnership with our parents and families comes in. I must say that there's very rarely a week goes by that I'm not amazed by the resources and resourcefulness of the families we work with. It's absolutely amazing. And it's kind of what keeps us going from our side.
But Molly Murray, where are the biggest challenges? What is the goal that you have and the challenges for you to get there?
Yeah, I think, for us, again, as a patient advocacy organization, I do think that it's, getting patients, I think that we have a responsibility, and I think Juliet, touched on this as well, to kind of serve as a resource to the patient community, and serve as a trusted resource when it comes to engaging in clinical trials, when it comes to engaging in patient registries. There's definitely a trust issue there, I think, sometime, and an understanding of what this means and what's going to take to engage in this space. Certainly, I think that Dr. Wilson, touched on this, sort of the lack of diversity in clinical trials and in patient registries, and how important it is to have those populations represented when you're looking for the types of data that you need to reach the solutions that are needed in terms of diagnostics and therapeutics. And so we're really trying to bridge that gap as an organization to build trust within the communities, certainly in minoritized communities as well. And I think from there, we're going to have more answers, more therapies, that can be, just beneficial across the board. And so I think for us, we just want to serve in that role, right? To bring understanding, to bring education to the community so that we can derive some solutions by the patient participating in the process and the patient getting engaged and feeling comfortable with engaging in the healthcare system and the clinical trials and patient registries that are out there. And I think they can only lead to good solutions.
But Molly, Murray, a follow-up to you on that, and Juliet, Choi, I'd like to get your perspective as well. Is Congress helping or hindering in this process? What's your message to them?
Molly, you go first here. This was great. This is a wonderful question.
Yeah, I think, so at the Autoimmune Association, we have 4 pillars, right? One of them, education, awareness, research, and advocacy, right? And so I think that, when you look at, rising costs, right, inflation, that we're facing as a nation just generally, right? And you look at how difficult it is to kind of have access to healthcare and getting coverage and rising out of pocket costs. I think there certainly is action that Congress can take, right, to address some of these issues. And I think that it's only getting more complex and more difficult to navigate. And certainly that is if somebody, for somebody who has insurance and understands the healthcare system, it's difficult to navigate. So you look at populations who don't have an insurance, who don't understand the healthcare system, and what that means in terms of getting access to care, what that means for delayed care, and how disease can progress when there isn't a timely treatment. I think that there's certainly a lot that Congress can do to break down some of those barriers and help patients navigate the system and get the care and coverage that they need. So a lot of work to be done in that space, and something that we're thinking about and working on. And
Juliet,
then
Choi, your quick
funding
follow-up
for research. I think there's a lot of. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm a DC resident. I'm still an optimist at heart here. And so I think Congress has made some investments, and I think the challenge is bringing about bipartisan support so proposed bills actually become realized legislation and laws of the land. Just to share a couple of examples without getting too wonky here, there is this longstanding bill called the Health Equity and Accountability Act. It's been introduced and reintroduced. I think one of the key elements in that bill does underscore and highlight the absolute need for disaggregated data. And we've talked about rare diseases, how it can impact different communities of color. And without disaggregated data, we're never going to know what we don't know. So we need to understand what our communities look like, how they're impacted. So the Health Equity Accountability Act is one that my organization and our partners in the health equity space, we continue to champion, particularly the disaggregated data lens. A couple of other efforts, I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that in the next, few years, again, with our panelists' voices and everybody else that's joining us, this conversation about rare diseases is so critical. There has been something called the Diverse Trials Act. And at its core, it does address tackling financial and technology barriers, right? So these are, common sense barriers, but actually need some required legislation to lower the threshold to make sure that our families can access the care where care is available. Last but not least, there's so many other opportunities here as well. The good doctor highlighted how many rare diseases continue to be discovered. We need Congress and the executive branch to be able to work in partnership so that we can accelerate approvals for treatments when it comes to rare diseases. One of the statistics I understand is of all rare diseases, only 5% of those rare diseases have FDA approved therapies and treatment plans. And so that, I think, low-hanging fruit together with Congress and the executive branch, we absolutely want, demand, and expect enhancements to take place over the next handful of months and years going forward.
And I want to thank all three of you for a fascinating conversation. Doctor, I want to let you have the final word with only about a half a minute left, but if you could put a capstone to this conversation, because you wrote, it is no longer a luxury to deal with rare diseases.
Right. So the treatments for rare disease are expected to top 22 to 24% of world drug expenditures in the next 4 or 5 years. This is a field that is going to become more and more mainstream. In fact, it's emerging as a field of medicine if we don't put some proper things in place, because it is different from a lot of our other fields of medicine, because these groups of individual rare diseases are so small. We've got to think about some new and creative ways to do things, because it is very different. So I think we got a lot of good people. We got a lot of smart folks. There, two of my fellow panelists here are two of them. I think I'm optimistic, and I will remain optimistic. And I'm also a DC resident, and as Juliet knows, that sometimes it's hard to maintain that, but we can.
Three very important voices representing the Autoimmune Association. We thank you for that. The director of the Rare Disease Institute at Children's National Hospital and the CEO of the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. We thank all of you for joining us here today. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.